The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. As you know, we've featured many fine authors such as John Mortimer, Ian Banks, Lawrence Block, so on. They're well worth revisiting, especially if you've come to us recently. And if you haven't yet subscribed, remember it's free. In this episode, we're delighted to be talking to Ian Leslie.
John is inextricable from Paul. In a way, this whole story is a testament to male emotional repression. For each of them, their relationship was the central relationship in their life. Quite a few of the songs are about each other.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Ian, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Oh, it's very good to be here. Thank you.
So the book is John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs. It's a brilliant idea, a sort of a dialectical history of the Beatles. Now, there used to be a sort of lazy convention, didn't there, even long after the Fabs had broken up, of comparing John and Paul all the time. But while I think it was a lazy convention, you're saying that it was actually appropriate. And in fact, they did it themselves.
Well, I think it became a game of, do you prefer John or Paul? You know, are you a John person, are you a Paul? Who is the greatest Beatle and so on? And I'm trying to get beyond that to say that actually, amazingly, this group brought two geniuses together and they created each other, or they helped to create each other. And actually, John, in inverted commas, is inextricable from Paul. Paul created John as much as John created Paul. And so the book is really about the strange and mysterious and wonderful chemistry at the heart of this incredible creative explosion that we call the Beatles.
Yes, because of course, as everybody knows, they met when they were very young. So there was still quite a lot of forming to be done, so that they sort of grew together and they learned together.
Yes. They effectively taught each other songwriting and playing and performing. Neither of them had much of a musical education at all. They didn't read music. They had one or two kind of relatives who were musical. Paul's father was musical. John's mother taught him some stuff on the banjo. But really, they were kind of working it out from scratch, from listening to records, listening to the radio, trying it out on guitar and seeing what worked, and sitting down with each other, you know, from when Paul was about 14 and John was about 16, and saying, well, how do we do this? And how can we make incredibly exciting, this kind of incredibly exciting music that we hear? How can we do something like that ourselves? And so it's this incredible story, actually, of sort of self-bootstrapping, of creating something out of nothing. I mean, there's no reason why the next huge thing, or, you know, this huge global phenomenon in music and rock and roll should have come out of England. You know, it's absolutely crazy. At the time, you know, America was absolutely dominant in entertainment, in music and rock and roll. And yet these two kids get together with no right to do what they do, take this American music and take it back to America after having conquered Britain. I do think it's the most astonishing story, and part of the point of the book is to just get people re-astonished, if you like, by just quite how amazing it is.
Well, there are other bands and other artistic expressions, though, that have more than one very, very talented person in them. You're saying, well, I mean, you call it a love story, and you don't mean that ironically, do you? You're not shipping them, as the kids say. You're not putting them just together as a romantic couple, but you think it was more than a sort of an artistic partnership.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Well, I think it was both. So I don't think they were sexual partners, but I think in every other sense it was romantic in a sense. It was certainly much more intense and turbulent and loving and intimate than most friendships, including most male friendships. You know, it is a kind of a friendship that kind of defies our categories, blurs the difference between lovers and friends and brothers and everything else. And I think we found it hard to kind of get to grips with what it is, because there aren't many relationships like that. There are a few, actually, if you go back through history. But it's a really unusually intense and conflicted and tempestuous relationship. And the music comes out of that chemistry. So I don't think you can understand the music of the Beatles without understanding the relationship, and vice versa.
If I understand the book, though, as well, one of the things one of the points you're making is that a large part of the relationship was conducted in music, in the way that the rest of us might talk to each other. If we were, a romantic couple, we might be in bed. But with John and Paul, it was getting on a level of communication that it's clear nobody else around them could share it.
Exactly right. And, this was an age before therapy and before we were supposed to, learn to talk out our feelings and so on. But here you had two very emotional, very intense young men, teenagers and then young men, who put all those feelings into the music. That's how they learned to express themselves emotionally, right? And lucky for us, I mean, in a way, this whole story is a testament to male emotional repression because, they didn't have anywhere to put this kind of like cauldron of feelings, not just about each other, but about, everything else.
Well, they had really, really difficult issues in there. John, in particular, had dreadful abandonment issues. I think everybody knows that it has to be said that there are not a lot of new stories in the book. It's what it is interpretation. So, yes, we all know that he lost his mother in difficult circumstances, and that Paul did as well. And I think what you're saying is that they didn't discuss this with each other, but they expressed it.
Yes. Yeah, John had this incredibly unstable childhood, and the more you look at it, the more you are struck by just how terrifyingly unsettling it was, kind of passed between parents who seemed to kind of abandon him and not be there when he needed them to be there. And Paul came from a much more secure, much more stable family background, but of course he lost his mother to cancer, fairly shockingly and disturbingly and mysteriously.
And quickly.
Quickly, yeah. And sort of inexplicably, nobody kind of sat him down and said, this is what's happened. It just kind of happened. So it was an incredibly, shattering blow. And then John, of course, loses his mother the next year, 1958. And so they don't speak about this, but it becomes a bond, but strengthens the bond between them. And yeah, so there's all this stuff going on beneath the surface. And as I say, they don't necessarily talk about this stuff very much, but they are sitting down and writing emotional pop songs together. Now, obviously, they're writing songs in the idiom of pop, right? So a lot of these songs are, I love you, you love me, and variations on kind of the language of
then
pop.
When they get inventive, she loves you.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a truly kind of inventive moment, but perhaps we'll get back to that. But, pop songs, even if they're idiomatic and sort of simple in some ways, they are songs of emotion. They're songs of yearning and love and jealousy and so they're kind of sharing these feelings with each other in songs. And of course, if you share any kind of creative work with another person, it's terrifying. You're exposing yourself to it's quite a vulnerable moment. And they learn to kind of open up that channel.
And not only that, but they're sitting opposite each other. Right? You make a lot of the eye contact that John and Paul had when they were first writing songs, but then all through their careers as well. And of course, that drives us back to the Get Back documentaries or to anthology. And I was because any Beatles book is going to make you listen to the records again and make you look at these things. You're absolutely right. They're always looking for each other. John and Paul are just checking each other out all the time. Is this working? Does this delight you? Are you with me? Are you listening? Are you watching?
Yeah. So I mean that's such an important channel, that kind of visual channel. They're kind of watching each other's face, and as you say, they were trained to do that from this early age because they were literally sitting opposite each other or standing opposite each other with guitars, and they're kind of watching the other's face to see what they're going to do and how they're singing and what what they're saying and how they're phrasing things and all sorts of things. So kind of watching the other one carefully and being very attuned to their emotions, really, and through their facial movements, was something that they kind of practiced and it became a habit from when they were teenagers. So then you see, they have this just very strong connection, which is both, subconscious and conscious. It's musical, it's physical, in the sense that they were kind of very attuned to each other's presence, and so much of what they then go on to achieve comes out of that sort of weird alchemy that they create when they first start songwriting together.
Well, I want to talk about some of the songs, as we've agreed. Well, I've said that a lot of the stories are familiar, but your interpretation, your focus on them, re-illuminates them. It's very interesting. You're extremely good on how come the first Beatles single happens to have a Lennon-McCartney song on both sides. How did that come about? Because that's not what you would have expected of a new group in 1962.
No. Well, first of all, the listeners might not be aware of how incredibly unusual it was for a group to perform their own songs. That wasn't the done thing. We're used to it now. But
well, because the Beatles made it the template. That's what you do.
Exactly. As I say somewhere in the book, it was much harder for the Beatles than anyone else because they didn't have the example of the Beatles to follow. They didn't really have any models to go on. So they used to talk about Rodgers and Hammerstein or maybe Lieber and Stoller, maybe Goffin and King. But, none of those partnerships were performing. Nobody wanted to see Rodgers and Hart on stage. Nobody knew what Lieber and Stoller were like as singers, So they were doing this thing, which was both writing songs and singing them and making this direct connection between the feelings that they're putting into the songs and then singing them on stage, which made them suddenly just feel a lot more authentic and real when they started doing that, which it took them a while to actually start performing their own songs.
And then it's a sea change in the Beatles, isn't it? Up to that time, George had been very much an equal partner because George was the chords man. George would go and find out all the chords to the records. But once John and Paul became the songwriting partnership, it shifted the dynamic, and they became that. In fact, I think you say in the book that the songwriting moved to the centre of the Beatles project, whereas it had been peripheral.
Yeah, up until then, because as we've been saying, it wasn't the done thing for a pop star or a group. Although the other thing we haven't mentioned is that there weren't really groups around, or not many. So that was another model they were inventing. It just wasn't the done thing for pop stars to write their own songs and perform them. So for most of their early career, before fame, John and Paul were writing songs, but they saw it as a kind of sideline in case the act didn't work. So we'll still be able to write songs for other people if we get good at it.
And they did, of course.
Right, and they certainly sort of gave some away, but obviously they kept most of them themselves. And so it was only post Brian Epstein and then post George Martin coming along where they went, actually we should be doing more of performing more of our own songs, incorporating them into the act, which had been up to 95% covers up until that stage. And then that's really the moment when the Beatles kind of switch on and it happens. It coincides with their first singles, with Please Please Me, Love Me Do, and then Please Please Me become these. Please Please Me in particular becomes this huge hit, and then,
which you deserve to. It's a wonderful record. Please
It's an
Please Me
incredible
is,
record, yeah.
I think, one of the great records of all time, and it brims with excitement.
It's so exciting. It's so sort of earthy and real. A lot of the pop around at that time was sort of pretty and neat and kind of quite nice. And then there's this kind of dirty, guttural John Lennon kind of like saying, "You please me, please me like I please
I thought
you."
it's filthy.
Yeah,
I mean, if you break
yeah.
down, if you look at what it's saying, I mean, it's essentially saying it takes two to heavy pet, doesn't it? I mean, please me like I please you. I complete for the time, it was ridiculous.
And even if you don't
explicit.
kind of get that, you can hear it, right, in the voice and in the performance. It's so kind of direct and powerful and physical, in its attack, and that's the point really at which they become this kind of new machine perfectly designed to kind of smash the charts wide open, where they're both writing songs and performing them, and they know how to make and they've got a producer who knows kind of how to make records, and it's like boom, okay. So it was only this kind of like strange series of kind of coincidences that we don't need to go into here now, that where they end up where George Martin says, okay, you can put your own songs on the record, but once it happens and once they're so good and once they become successful in that first couple of singles, that's it. The whole world has changed.
As you say, we're so used to aspects of the Beatles story, we don't notice how unusual it is. There's that shared credit arrangement, the Lennon-McCartney rubric, which the world came very happily to accept, but it's weird. It's a very strange thing to have done. Nobody else did. Well, there was Mick and Keith, and there were actually nobody else.
Well, no, I mean Mick and Keith started much later than but partly because they were inspired by the example of John and Paul.
What I want you to tell me though is that the songwriting relationship was fairly porous. They drew in other people's ideas. George Harrison contributed to songs, but there was never ever a suggestion of giving George a credit, and that's quite significant.
So there was a moment once they kind of just on the verge of fame, they get offered. Brian Epstein takes the two of them aside and said, "Look, we think you should be recording your own songs, and so that means we're going to have to do a separate deal with you two because you're the songwriters, as well as the contract that we have with the group." And then he asked them to consider whether or not they wanted to incorporate any, the other Beatles, primarily George, into that arrangement, right? So it could have been Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and they discuss it. That could have happened, but they go for a walk. Rather actually, they go for a walk past Woolton Church, St. Peter's Church in Woolton, where they first met, and they decide, let's just keep it me and you. And that's because they had the friendship, they had the connection, this deep connection, I think. So for them, it wasn't just a kind of professional matter, what would work best, should we incorporate it and so on. No, but they had this friendship. They thought they were superior. They frankly thought each other was the best songwriter around, and George wasn't on their level, right?
Well, they were right about that.
And they were right, right.
To be fair.
And nobody else was,
But that doesn't mean that George wasn't making contributions to.
Oh, I know. And George,
other people, Donovan put a line into Yellow Submarine, but there was never any suggestion that you'd acknowledge that in the credits.
No, I mean, I think that's partly a kind of, the financial thing. I mean, the other economic thing here is that they are deciding effectively that we're going to be earning more money than the rest of the group if we do this, which they did, and that kind of became a dividing line, a tension within the group. So these kind of decisions get taken. But the other thing I want to say, well, a couple of things. One is that, yes, they decide to keep it Lennon and McCartney. It doesn't surprise me so much that they didn't want to incorporate George or anyone else into that partnership. It does slightly surprise me. I think the more interesting thing is that they decided that whoever came up with a song, it would be credited to the two of them. So we weren't going to have John Lennon songs, Paul McCartney songs. Everything was going to be Lennon McCartney, even if it was really Paul's songs or even if it was really John's song. So they kind of took the ego out of it effectively, and that meant that they could both could kind of contribute to each other's songs.
And it didn't matter who came up with the good bits.
And it didn't, yeah. And they very quickly understood that emotionally as well as rationally, that if John comes up with a brilliant bit that makes this song work, that's good. It's good for me, and vice versa. And equally, if I don't think John's song is good, or I don't think Paul's song is good, or if Paul tells me my song isn't working, or vice versa, that's fine too. So they weren't kind of getting possessive about their own work. They both realised, this song has just got to be the best it can be. It's got to be the best Lennon-McCartney song it can be, and then the best Beatles song it can be. So who came up with it and who kind of determines who does it is not so important. So that was a kind of structural kind of change. The other thing to say about their songwriter partnership, because there's so much to say about how new it was, is there was no division of labour between words and music. Again, incredibly unusual. Think about all those songwriting partnerships that we've mentioned already. Think about the ones that came after, like Jagger and Richards. There's nearly always a division of labour. Somebody writes the words, somebody writes the music, right? Sometimes they kind of swap around, but you kind of know. Never happened with John and Paul. They both wrote words and they both wrote music. which was confusing at the time, is still a little bit. It's still very unusual now, but even then, again, they were doing something that other people weren't doing. So yeah, there's just so much about which we kind of take so much of it for granted now. But there's so much that was going on that was innovative and unusual that I want to kind of draw people's attention to that.
Well, that of course, that satisfies the whole world up until about 1965, when people noticed Yesterday. Yesterday was a breakthrough. In fact, you identify, I think, is it the 14th of June 1965 as being a sort of a watershed moment. What happened? What was Paul McCartney's breakthrough on that day?
So on that day, Paul McCartney, the Beatles record 3 songs, and they're all Paul songs. So they do I've Just Seen a Face, I'm Down, and Yesterday. In one day. Which is just astonishing in itself.
It is.
And then you think about the fact that these were all very different styles of song. So I've Just Seen a Face is this kind of rollicking, kind of country-ish, folkish love song. I'm Down is this screaming rock and roll song, which they use to close out their shows. Paul kind of really throws himself into that, and the whole band does. And then Yesterday, of course, we all know is this sad ballad. And so Paul records all 3 of these songs and nails the vocals on every one of them in these 3 wildly divergent styles. And they're all great songs, very, very different songs, but all great songs.
It was a good day for Paul.
It's an incredible day, right? It's incredible. And it's the day and the kind of moment where I think Paul starts to really come into his own. The early first couple of years of the Beatles' recording career, Lennon is quite dominant. His voice is quite dominant on those albums. Paul certainly has some huge hits, Can't Buy Me Love, and I Saw Her Standing There, and
All My Loving.
All My Loving, some of these beautiful romantic ones as well. But you listen to Please Please Me and with the Beatles' Hard Day's Night, it's John who's really kind of like the strongest voice in every sense on those albums. Now, around 1965, when on the day we're talking about, Paul starts to really kind of realise the full extent of his talents, and they are kind of obviously immense. And I think this precipitates a kind of change in the balance of power within the group. I think the song Yesterday, in particular, because it is all Paul, that's how it ends up.
He's the only Beatle on the track.
He's the only Beatle on the track. And even in concert, the others literally leave the stage so that he can sing alone in a spotlight. This triggers John's insecurities about the group and about his place in the group and about Paul's place in the group.
Well, George Martin wanted to release it as a solo Paul song.
There were. I mean, I think there were discussions about that. Should it be a solo Paul song? And in the end, they decided it was Beatles. It slightly unexpectedly, it then becomes this huge hit in the States first, and then it becomes a hit everywhere, and people start covering it, or it's the most covered song ever. And so it becomes this kind of like pivotal moment where people are like, wow, the Beatles can do this incredibly sophisticated sounding music. And this song is all Paul. And that's just it's a difficult moment, I think, for the Lennon-McCartney relationship. Although obviously if it triggers insecurities and tensions, they're incredibly creative ones, because it only accelerates and heightens the creativity of the music that follows.
Well, the best was yet to come. I want to talk for a moment about the Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever single, partly because I think it was about the high point of Western culture, but also because it's a beautiful expression of your thesis of the dialogue between Lennon and McCartney. So tell me about that single and how it came to be and why it matters.
Well, Strawberry Fields was written by John when he was on location for a film that he was shooting, the second half of 1966. He was not around the other Beatles very much. Obviously, Ringo went to visit him, but he wasn't around the other Beatles very much. He's feeling a little bit disconnected, a bit weird. A lot of this had to do with the fact that they'd just come off what turned out to be their last tour, and they basically decided by that stage they weren't going to do another tour. So he was thinking, well, what am I now? And again, it's hard for us to grasp that there was no such thing as a pop act that didn't tour, you know. And so they decided not to tour and said, we're going to just be in the studio now. But that wasn't an obvious kind of, again, there's no model for that. Like
But everything the Beatles did was they had to.
So John he's having a bit of an identity crisis himself. You know, it's like, what am I? You know, when I'm not a Beatle, who am I? And he obviously has his guitar with him in Spain, so that he spends a lot of time just trying to make this little song about childhood work, and he's going back to Strawberry Field, which was this place, an orphanage, appropriate enough, because he used to kind of talk about himself as an orphan in some ways. And, you know, he kind of invents this whole kind of new way of communicating in a song where he's kind of showing you how difficult it is for him to work this thing through. So the lyrics are kind of very stilted and kind of he keeps going back on himself. But in the end, he says, you know, it's not too bad down here in Strawberry Fields. So he writes this kind of amazingly strange and beautiful song. And this makes Paul think, well, okay, I don't know what level Paul thinks this, whether or not it's rational or it just sort of happens intuitively. But he now decides to write a song about Liverpool, another kind of site from, you know, their childhoods. And he chooses to write about Penny Lane. Actually, it was John who lived on Penny Lane for a while. But Penny Lane was also where they used to meet up when they were going into town. They used to meet up at the roundabout. And whereas John goes into this strange inner world in order to express his kind of feelings about childhood and adulthood, Paul kind of zooms up and out and creates this panorama of a kind of idealized little village of Penny Lane. And they're both actually deeply strange songs. I mean, Strawberry Fields is more obviously strange because it's harmonically musically so weird and the lyrics are so odd. Penny Lane is more of a pop song, but actually once you get down to it and you look at the way it's constructed and you look at the lyrics, they're actually very strange. You know, I mean, in fact, he says at the end of every verse, you know, very strange. And there's a little hint that there's more going on in this, you know, under the surface that than is apparent. So, they're both just sort of two incredibly, you know, Strawberry Fields is incredibly Lennon-esque and Penny Lane is incredibly McCartney-esque. They're really kind of pushing at the edges of their respective artistic sensibilities.
This is the point you're making. Again, I'm going to quote from your book that Paul seemed to write songs that had always been there somehow, whereas Lennon was reaching out and bringing something from another planet. And of course, that's why Paul needed him, isn't it? Paul McCartney could do everything musically. He's probably the most musical person of his generation. But Lennon could access places that Paul didn't even know were there in the first place. That's why he still needed him. You mentioned that John became a little insecure, and I think his insecurities only deepened. You know, there's an occasion when Paul does a movie soundtrack in 1966, The Family Way. There's an occasion that you do in the book when John gets very cross because Paul asks other people to help him with a song. It's Eleanor Rigby and I think Mal Evans, who was a postman, and their road manager, Neil Aspinall, were there. And Paul says, you know, make suggestions. And John gets cross. You know, these aren't people that you write songs with. What I'm leading to is, in the end, did John need Paul more than Paul needed John?
I think that it did feel a bit like that too. I think so, yeah. Not. Well, I don't think we're saying like musically, but we're talking emotionally, right? And certainly around 1967, 68. I think Paul was really leaning on Paul. John was leaning on Paul and the Beatles more than Paul was leaning on, more than Paul needed it. And Cynthia makes a remark around that time in front of a journalist called Hunter Davis, where she says, you know, you clearly need the Beatles more than they need you. because she's getting a bit annoyed by the fact that he's just wants to spend all his time with them and not with her and their kid. And I think there was truth to that. He became kind of emotionally dependent on the group in the way that the others were not quite.
But then it's Paul who wants to keep it together. Somebody has said that the Get Back project was basically Paul's attempt to get John back into a songwriting partnership, and I think there's plausibility to that one. And yet, this is the point at which they're drifting away. Now, you make another lovely inversion, a lovely interpretation that, unlike other situations where, people might drift apart and get married, John and Paul had to get married in order to drift apart.
Yeah. I think they realised at some level that they were entangled with each other in such a kind of intense and volatile way that they now had to find a way out. And it was just too intense, really. And so I don't think it was a case, as is usually presented, that, John falls in love with Yoko and then turns around to the others and Paul and says, right, I'm with her now, I've got to leave. And neither do I think it's the case that Paul finds Linda and is like, oh, okay, I've got to go with Linda now. I think it was kind of the other way around.
John needed to fall in love with Yoko.
Yeah.
It's what was going on, isn't it?
Yeah. And similarly with Paul, and if you look at the timelines, but Yoko had been around for quite a while.
John marries her a few days after Paul marries
Linda. So Yoko he'd known Yoko for a long time and they'd been friendly, right? And maybe that he fancied her a bit, but none of his friends thought that he was in love with her or fancied her. And then suddenly he's like, right, this is the woman for me. And then right away, right after that, Paul is like, who's dating several women at once, as he always did, yes. Is like, right, Linda.
Paul's sex life in your book is eye-watering.
Yeah.
Enviable, but eye-watering.
Paul's like, right, of these women, right, Linda, right, we're going with Linda. And these happen almost simultaneously. Paul right after John, but they're both kind of like turning around and saying, right, let's do this. And then they get married within weeks of each other, right? So this wasn't a case of them just happening to meet the loves of their lives and kind of like going. It was more a case of them deciding at some level we need to kind of move apart from each other because we're getting too close. It's too intense, really. It's not working, and they kind of find a way out. And so I think that's what Hey Jude is about, really. You found her, now go and get her.
I was going to go there. One of the tropes of your book is that clearly not every song that Lennon and McCartney wrote was directed at each other. When John writes "Oh Yoko" on one of his later albums, that's clearly not a song about Paul. But a lot more of them are for you, and a lot more of them can be interpreted, and it sort of shines a light on the relationship if you look at it, what they're saying within it.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be surprising. I mean, for each of them, their relationship was the central relationship in their life, or co-equal with another relationship for nearly all that time, right? And given what we've said about them, about the intensity of their relationship and about the kind of feelings and what they did with them, which they put them into music. It shouldn't be a surprise that I think, quite a few of the songs are in some way about each other.
Two of us. Talk about Two of Us on the Let It Be album.
Yeah, so Two of Us, which if you ask Paul what is Two of Us about, he'll tell you that, and I believe him, by the way, I'm just not disbelieve that it's about Linda, because it's they used to go on drives together, when they first met, and just go on these kind of like crazy, not going anywhere in particular, just going for a drive. And Paul's kind of felt very liberated by that, as somebody who always liked to know where he was going. Linda kind of helped him go, well, it doesn't matter, we'll just go for a drive. So he starts writing this song, and on one of those drives gets his guitar out and starts writing this song, Two of Us. But look, I mean, the song is so wistful and backward-looking and kind of elegiac.
And contains things that can't possibly be about Linda. We've been on a road so long, longer than the road that stretches. And I
have memories longer than the road that stretches out ahead of us.
That's not Linda.
That's not Linda. And the whole mood of the song is, it's not like, I've just fallen in love and I'm excited, which Paul was really good at writing those songs, right? It's much more it's this beautiful, wistful kind of like, we've known each other a long time, haven't we? And now we're going home. So there's something kind of, it's
But the
sort of
best
sad and
songs
nostalgic
can work
about
on
it.
several levels, so which is what a lot of the... In fact, it's one of the reasons that Lennon and McCartney were much greater songwriters than George. Too many of George's songs only have one level of meaning.
Yeah.
Some of them are very good, but so many of them just have one straight interpretation. Whereas John and Paul's, you can delve down and find things. So that, and of course, after the Beatles break up, they're actually writing songs directly to each other as well. And I wrote a small number down. There's too many people on the album, on Paul's album Ram, which is directed at John. How Do You Sleep on John's Imagine album is a vicious riposte. And then there's Let Me Roll It on Band on the Run. Instant Karma, you think, is directed at Paul. I'd never really thought about that, but of course I go back and listen to it and I see what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes interpreted as a song of peace and love and so on. I mean, does it sound like peace and love to you? Just in the noise of the song and the sound of John's vocal, it's like this really brilliantly angry song. I think quite a spiteful song. I think it's partly kind of John having a rant about Paul. But then, John also writes much more tender songs about Paul later on as well. Paul says that John told him Jealous Guy was about him.
Interesting. Again,
Yeah.
it could be directed at women, but when you look at it from the Ian Leslie perspective, it works.
Yeah, and you're framing it in the right way, and that I'm, as you know, in the book, I'm not insisting on one particular interpretation. I'm not saying, this song is about this and it's not about this. I'm saying the reason this song is so powerful is it resonates on different levels, and often you'll find that one of those levels is about John and Paul. I think you can see particularly those songs in the last year of their time together are quite intense, and a song like Oh Darling, it's about a breakup, and I think they were going through the most almighty breakup with each other. So
Again,
I think,
I listen to the one now in this light and think, I see where you're coming from. And even if it wasn't explicitly intended that way, the subtext works for it too.
Yeah, and they were doing that right from the beginning, right? Oh Darling is kind of in the idiom of a sort of bluesy rock and roll song, right? But they pour these other feelings and stories into them, so that it becomes something else. It's not just a simple, conventional love song.
Well, all the best Beatles books send you back to the records, and this one did as well. It is Ian Leslie's John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs, which is published by Faber at £25. As you can tell, I found it utterly compelling. And thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe for free on your favourite podcast player to be notified of upcoming episodes. For our next show, we'll be talking to John Higgs about Exterminate, Regenerate, his history of Doctor Who. Would you like a jelly baby?
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.